This time around on Author's Corner, thrilled to welcome Nate Blum to the show. His book is called Sorgho Squad, Chapter 1, From the Ruins Comes Jowar. And this whole concept and these future books, wait till you hear his story. It is so interesting. Nate, thanks for popping on.
Ms. Delaney, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
So let's talk about the motivation behind writing this and then what ultimately is going to be a series of books.
Well, the motivation is a simple fact that sorghum and millets are among the first grains ever cultivated by mankind. And they're not only nutritious, and the research is showing how great those are in human diets, but they're also very sustainable for the environment, using a third of the water and greatly impacting biodiversity and soil health. But the reality is that we've all forgotten that these grains exist outside of some pockets in the world, like India and parts of Africa. And so what we're hoping to do with the Sorgho Squad books is not only bring a bit of education to consumers here in other parts of the world, but also make them a little bit of fun. And I think we've struck a right balance there.
Yeah, and tell the listeners about the background with the posters, because the illustrations are amazing.
Right. So about 2 years ago, we started an international group. Now, I used to be the executive director of the Nebraska Grain Sorghum Board. And while I was there, I was at a conference in Toulouse, France, where I heard some of my counterparts talking about the challenges within the industry in Europe. And I realized, my gosh, guys, these are the same problems we have in the U.S. We're going to be competitors maybe in the commodity stage, but let's find some ways to work together. And so from there grew our group, which is called Sorghum United. And we came together really around the very simple concept of wherever you go in the world, sorghum is called something different. And that makes it incredibly difficult when you're on trade missions or you're trying to do business overseas. Because if I say sorghum in a place where they say sorgho, they might look at me pretty funny. So our group came up with the idea that we would use some of the most common nomenclatures around the world for these grains and put them all on the same page so people would recognize that they're the same thing. And so from there, we came up with three characters. We have Milo. He's a young character. He represents the nomenclature here in North America and also the environmental benefits of sorghum in cropping systems and rotations. And then we have Mashila. Mashila is the common nomenclature in Ethiopia, and she represents the health and nutrition benefits of sorghum in human and animal diets. And then we have Jowar. Jowar is the common nomenclature in India, or actually one of several common nomenclatures in India. And Jowar represents the industrial applications for sorghum for fuel and fiber type purposes. And so from these, we developed 10 different posters that happen to coincide with the International Year of Millets at the United Nations. And I'm very happy to report that not only are those posters available on our website at sorghumunited.com for free download in 4 of the 6 United Nations languages, but I hand-delivered a set of those posters in English to the United Nations Food and Ag Organization office in Rome in December at the opening ceremony of the International Year. So the books are meant to give more context to those characters and to provide their story, whereas the posters have a lot of very interesting and useful facts. And actually, we really encourage teachers to print them off, put them up in their classrooms. There's a lot of things that I think children can learn from those too.
What do people not understand about sorghum? What do they not understand?
Well, usually it's just a question of, I work in sorghum, and then the question is, what is sorghum? So the question is really, what is it? And even within the agricultural industry, often it's just looked at as it's animal feed, right? Interestingly enough, a little over 100 years ago, corn was just used as animal feed as well. So we're really reintroducing it is what we're doing. This is kind of a post-colonial holdover, I should say. So what happened was, again, these grains are ancient grains. They've been grown around the world for millennia. But what happened when European powers went into Asia, parts of Africa, where these grains were being grown, they didn't recognize them. They didn't know what they were. And so they convinced the local populations, well, you don't want to grow that. You want to grow corn and wheat instead. The reality is that there's room on the table, or room on the plate, I should say, for all of these grains. We like corn, we like wheat, we like soybeans. But there's definitely benefits not only in cropping rotations and cropping systems to including sorghum in the farm, But also from a human health aspect, there are over 200 different research papers from around the world, different institutions, that have all come to the same conclusions in that sorghum has anti-inflammatory benefits. It helps to rebalance the human gut microbiome. There's anti-carcinogenic benefits and heart health benefits, just to name a few. So it makes sense to reintroduce these and get these back on the plate.
So let's talk about, that was a great explanation. You definitely know sorghum, so for sure, you're in the right spot. So Sorgho Squad, and as I said, there were a series of books, graphic novel style. Tell us about like the first book.
Right. So in the first book, we have Professor Sorgho, who has the same haircut I do, and that's not by accident. And his assistant, Alice Atlas. And they're trying to find solutions to some of the world's largest problems. And these are real world problems, by the way, around hunger, malnutrition, environmental sustainability. And the professor rediscovers some ancient tales of a super team, an ancient grain super team that's been lost over time. And so actually the first 3 books are kind of adventure books where they're going to real life locations, archaeological sites mostly, to try to find these characters and reunite them as a Sorgho Squad team. So in the first book, we meet Jowar. I don't want to spoil too much, but they find Jowar in the Indus Valley, which is actually in Pakistan, but that region, Pakistan and India, both use a lot of sorghum and millets. So that makes a lot of sense. And they're able to wake him up because the sorghum, of course, when it gets too dry in a drought, it doesn't die like other crops. It just goes dormant. So a little bit of water and he perks right back up and wakes up. And then they're on to the next adventure in book 2, which is where they'll find Mashila in Ethiopia at the underground churches in Lalibela. And then the third book, they're on to North America where they'll find Milo. And that one is going to be a little bit of a surprise. There's a bit of a twist in it. So I don't want to say too much about that. But the second book will be up here within the next couple of weeks on Amazon. And the third book is actually being illustrated right now by my partner, Jordan Scribner. When I was writing these, I really very much had that kind of a format in mind. So they're really an easy read, but they're fun. They're informative. And then when I found Jordan's illustrations, he's very much a graphic novel style artist. And I mean, it was just a match made in heaven, so to speak. But I describe the books, if you're reading them casually, I describe them as Indiana Jones meets Captain Planet. So again, informative, but also a lot of fun.
Yeah. So and you pretty much told us this, but what do you hope the takeaway is for anybody listening to us and saying, I'm going to get that for my grandkid, or I'm just going to get it and read it, or, a lot of us like graphic novel style entertainment because it is entertaining and educational. That's the thing. I think you've matched both of them. What do you hope the takeaway is?
Well, I hope the takeaway is that people want to know more. I hope they go to the Sorgho Squad website, but I also hope they go to Sorghum United. I hope they go to their grocery store and say, hey, I'm not seeing sorghum flour on the shelf, or I'm not seeing whole grain or pearled grain sorghum on the shelf. Or maybe they're going to, their local food processor and saying, hey, why aren't we using more of these grains? That's really what we're hoping the takeaway is just that basic awareness. The reality is, when we talk about agriculture, and again, I grew up on a farm, but I grow crops about as well as I grow full head of hair. And when I talk to farmers, though, what they tell me is, they would love to grow sorghum or millets in the rotation if they had somewhere to sell it. The reality is that 93% of U.S. sorghum gets on a boat and goes to China, right? What that means is if you're in Texas or somewhere near a port, you're doing pretty good when prices are good for sorghum overseas. But if you're in Nebraska, where I live, or anywhere really north of Texas, you're never going to get that premium because you're paying for the transportation costs. Now, what we do have in Nebraska and other parts of the world where these grains are grown is that we might not be near a port, but we're centrally located for that domestic market. And so what we'd like to do is have more value-added processing proximate to the farm so that our farmers then can include this in rotation and maybe get it under contract instead of settling for a commodity price that they can't control. And when we do that, we can not only create jobs in a community, but we can also increase on-farm revenues. So it's really prosperity through macroeconomics, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, the same is true in the U.S. for a conventional farmer as it is in, say, Uganda for a smallholder farmer, where the local farmers are growing these grains already, but they're just going into low-value animal feed. Meanwhile, in the country, there are issues around malnutrition and hunger. So ultimately, what these books will do, in addition to another funding source that we're working on, because we are an international NGO, we're a nonprofit, but we want to be self-sustaining, right? If we talk about sustainability, I think that starts at home. So we want our organization to be financially sustainable. So what these funding sources ultimately will do, outside of just education and increasing opportunities along the value chain, it'll ultimately be able to fund our efforts to create entrepreneurial and small business development hubs that are using sorghum and millets in places like Uganda or Jordan or Malaysia. So we can create that same kind of prosperity there. And even bigger picture, honestly, Kate, is that we know that political stability often comes from economic sustainability. And when people have full bellies and they're doing well financially, the rest tends to come into place over time. And so that's what we're hoping to achieve in the long run. So, I mean, not to sound grandiose, but we're only trying to solve world hunger and create opportunities for political stability around the globe.
Sounds good to me, Nate. What a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure, Kate. Thank you so much.
Visit www.greatwritersmedia.com. Email us at info@greatwritersmedia.com. Call us at 877-600-5469. Subscribe now.